This conference will now be recorded.
All right, everybody, welcome back. Yeah, so today I wanted to talk about a few things. We're going to progress in some ways, and then in some ways we're going to take a step back and look at some stuff a little bit more thoroughly. One thing, and it makes sense that this is a theme, I want to emphasize pushing the gesture even at the detriment of the line work. So right now I'm showing you a rough animation that I'm working on, and look how shitty that line work is, right? So bad. But the motion comes across, like you kind of get what's going on. So I want to, even though I'm a huge fan of tight line work, right? I really like the way that looks. um I want everybody to kind of calm down, or I mean, not everybody's been, or some people have been drawing loosely, but I kind of want to get into the mindset of um, getting us to start loose, to really push the pose, and then clean up as we go. Um, so that's one thing I want to talk about. Another thing that I'm alluding to here, which I didn't get started on just yet, or I didn't, we're going to go back over, is drawing using a platform and using a 3D environment, right? So Clip Studio is awesome. It's got this tool where you can move the platform around. I love this. I use it for everything. So we'll have a look at drawing characters using that. And what else are we going to do? We're going to talk about drawing characters at different camera lengths. So characters that are close up, characters that are far away, and how you have to treat those differently. One thing I notice is when artists are drawing faces and they're doing a full figure shot, they'll tend to treat the figure, or they'll tend to treat the face the same way as if you're getting a super duper close up shot. And that's just not the way you want to go about it. Even in that character sheet that I'm showing you here, yeah, there's some similarities, and maybe I even went into a little too much detail on his face there. But you go into more detail the closer up you go with your shots. Uh, so that's something we're going to talk about. Oh yeah, that's why I pulled up this one from One Piece. I just got a bunch of screenshots here from One Piece. Um, Characters at different distances to the camera. Or here's another example. So much detail, very, very little detail, just simplified versions of the shapes super far away. Cool. The other thing we're going to talk about is methods of building tension and the sort of the components we can change about a pose to make it more tense and more interesting. And then what else I have? We might draw faces and heads and that sort of thing. So a couple different things on the list today to get done. So we'll get started on that. Any questions about any stuff we talked about so far? Cool. All right, I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to pull up some reference, and we're going to start drawing with the reference. Frankie's worried. Don't worry about it. It's nothing to worry about. Everybody stay calm. We're going to be just fine, I think. Don't bite. But after last week, what I want everybody to do is just completely forget about anatomy. I don't even know what anatomy is. Who cares about anatomy, right? We're just going to draw figures. We're going to talk about how we can push the pose. Let me just get my windows open because they all closed. Okay, cool. Cool. So yeah, we just did a super long, not super long, but just a review session before, or a feedback session before we got in. And the thing that catches my attention is, and this is a natural thing to happen, which is we have a tendency to rely on the reference maybe a little too much, or not push what's important about the reference. And I want you to see your role as an artist, not to replicate what you're looking at, but I want you to look at a reference, pick out what's important, and then try to emphasize this. This is a cool one because it's already sick. It doesn't need, like this pose doesn't need much exaggeration, which is kind of why I'm picking it out. But it's pretty dope, right? So let's break it down from a few standpoints. So form-wise, if I look at his rib cage and his pelvis, his ribs are kind of tilted, or sorry, yeah, his ribs are tilted back in comparison to his pelvis, which is angled towards the camera. Oh yeah, another important thing I wanted to talk about is we want to do whatever we can to emphasize the sort of the counterbalancing of the rib cage and the pelvis, right? If we're looking at body in side view, right? We've got this back tilt of the rib cage, forward tilt of the pelvis. That's kind of a element that we want to focus on. Or just we always want the ribs and the pelvis to be counterbalancing each other. Okay, so going back to this. So we've got that twisting of the forms. Also, you got all this gesture that's leading up to that shoulder, right? So we've got the twisting forms, everything's going up to that shoulder that's far back, right? We've got this leg in front that's bracing it, and this one that's bending to sort of take that motion. What are things we can do to push it even further? Even though personally, I don't think it needs to be pushed that much further. You could imagine that if you were in this pose and you were trying to make it even more intense, the further back you bring that left arm, the more tension you're going to put in the body, right? So the further back that arm is, and if I'm keeping this knee roughly in the same spot, I'm going to keep twisting that body. The same way when we were doing the flour sack, right? We did like a subtle twist, and then we twisted the shit out of it to the point where it got all twisted up in the center, right? So that's one way we can add more intensity to an action is we can take limbs and move them into different areas, right? So if this is creating a straight line, maybe we think it would be cooler to bring that back. Cool. That's one way. The other thing we can do, which we're not going to talk about today, but the other thing we can do to make poses more interesting is change the camera angle and the camera lens. So we could use more dynamic fisheye lenses. I don't want to get into that yet. We'll do that next week. So don't worry about that just yet. I want to cover how to figure out platforms. Okay. But we had this question during the feedback, and so I think it's probably a good idea to address, which is someone asked, how much does the shape change, or like how much does the scale change when something's foreshortened? And the answer is that is completely dependent on where the camera is. So in this case, the person is far away from the camera. I'll show a few elements of how we know that. But when someone's far away from the camera, no matter where they are, the scale isn't going to change, right? Like even if he brings his head closer to the camera, it's still going to be roughly around this height because he's super far away from the camera right now. Okay, how do we know that? Well, there's a couple of indicators, right? There's diagonal. These lines are, they would normally be diagonal, but they're just so parallel. And there's like a subtle texture on the ground that you can kind of see, but everything feels like you sort of compressed it. There's a lot of things that are parallel. It's hard to see because he's twisting, but if he were just standing upright, everything would be horizontally across. But really the key thing that's cueing me into the fact that he's far from the camera is the scale of everything is the same, right? If somebody was, I'm going to pull up a little fooly cooly for a moment. If someone's close to the camera, whatever's closest to the camera gets bigger and whatever's far away gets smaller. So versus this shot where she's further from the camera, so everything is the scale it normally would be, right? So that's kind of just a general rule of thumb. If something's close up to a camera and you want to build that effect of something sweeping past the camera or being close, you're going to use distorted scale. Today, we're not going to do that. Forget I even talked about it. It's stupid. We don't want to do that. So, awesome. Okay. So let's actually start drawing because that's a good idea. And we want to push the main thing that's going on here, which is twisting of the form. We've got this really, really nice C curve going on. Head is tilted. I'm going to change the tilt of the head a little bit. And we can continue. It's I'm actually, you know what? I'm going to draw the hand back here. Sometimes if elements are foreshortening, I find it helpful to use things like ellipses to really help convey to me how things are overlapping. Get that shoulder line. I'm going to bring back that shoulder a little bit as well. Here's a subtle one, but you could tilt the shoe up a little bit to show that it's sort of coming off the ground a little bit. Okay, what about the knee? I think it would, I don't know if it would help. You know, sometimes things like experimenting with different poses, experimenting with what makes it feel more tense would be better, right? Would it help to bring the knee in like this and out? I don't think so. Or would it help to have his leg so far extended that it feels like we're getting all that compression in on the left side there? And his arm kind of just goes straight down, but I'm going to actually bring it back, almost even bend it the opposite way. And you know what? I think if I make the shoulder line a little more vertical, yeah, that's better. But there's a push and pull that goes on, playing around with stuff. And also he should look in the direction that he's hitting the ball. It's a good idea. Cool. Cool. All right, I don't like it, but that's all right. Let's do another one. We're going to keep focusing on pushing the pose. So this one, same deal. We've got twist going on. Rib cage is sort of down to the side. Pelvis is facing forward. We can, what are ways we can exaggerate this? Well, I think we could bring this shoulder, the further to the right that we bring that, the more intense that pose is going to be, right? Again, just imagine twisting a screw. It's like we're turning this form. Do I want to change the angles of the legs? Maybe. I like the contrast of this leg going out. And okay, this arm on the right, it might actually be good if we bring it far back enough that we cover up the bicep and we only see the forearm. So let's give that a go. I'm gonna start with the shoulder line, hip line. I could drop the head a little bit. Let's bring that shoulder even closer. Right, and think about this form for a moment, right? I have the mannequin of his torso, which let's just keep it simple. We'll use just like a trapezoid. As he turns in the direction I want him to turn, which is counterclockwise, we're going to see more of that shoulder socket. Right, so that ellipse is going to get wider. And then I'm also rotating it down this way. So I'm making two changes to the pose. So now we've got an angle to that shoulder. Right. And one of the things that happened that was to be expected is we started talking about anatomy, and then our mannequins got more complicated, which is to be, which is understandable. But I want you to keep the mannequin really simple. Don't worry about anatomy complicating it. Right? Still want to learn anatomy. It's obviously super important, but it's more important to have poses that are lively and exciting. And it's important to go into poses thinking about what we can change and what we can make more appealing. Sometimes I'll add little cloth details. Cloth is interesting because it shows a lot of the tension lines, which we will talk about in our cloth class. My cursor knows no bounds. I'm just drawing over the page. Doesn't matter. So I'm going to change the shape design on the face. It's a little too big. Cool. All right, so we're keeping things loose, messy, but we're making changes. So whenever you start to introduce new elements to drawing, so like the idea of taking a reference and then changing what's going on there is probably pretty difficult if it's not something that you've done. So take, take some constraints off, right? A lot of people, when they're doing their drawings, it seems like they're really, really trying to like maximize the quality of those lines right now. Let's not worry too much about that. Let's worry about pushing the gestures. Cool. All right, I'm gonna go to casual one and I'm gonna actually draw the full thing. All right, I'm gonna start without adding platforms and then we'll talk about how to add that in. Pose I'm doing is this one on the left here. It's also, they're marketing some shirts and tops to me. So if we want to buy that, we can do that after. All right. The main focus of this pose is this back C curve that's going on, right? So actually, let me start over for a second. The main gesture is this curve leaning back. And then everything else is trying to counterbalance that back leaning of the spine. So it's something along those lines. So I'm starting with that curvature. I like to draw some of these like more fashion design poses for neutral poses than a lot of the figure reference. I think they do a better job of capturing like the nuances of the way the spine works in a more interesting way. So I definitely suggest that.
One thing I kind of learned in this class that figure packs low-key kind of suck.
Yeah, they do. And if you want to make it more interesting, you can definitely push stuff, right? There's things you can do to make it more interesting, but they in general aren't so great. You know, and it's no shade to them. I mean, I think the idea or the main idea is that like you can use that as like a jumping off point or an inspiration, but our main goal is to take certain things and to tweak them.
Okay.
Like for example, speaking of tweaking, I'm using figure reference, but I'm going to use a different character model, and I'm going to apply that character model from Il Kwang Kim, who's super cool, great character designer for Studio Mir, and I'm going to apply that to these figures. He does this thing, I was talking about it in the feedback, where he takes the waist shape, and rather than having it kind of low, he raises that bad boy up. So the shape of the waist is super high in comparison, and then the legs are much longer as a result. You see that in like Mega Man and stuff. All right, so we're being nice and loose with the line work. talk a little bit about his shape design in a second too. Occasionally, if I'm getting lost or confused or something, I'll use wrapping lines to give me that info. Tell me, what direction is something going in. This whole leg is sort of angled outward. And I'm going to push the head. I'm going to angle it back a little bit more. Another thing I'll do with like hair, and I know we didn't talk about hair yet, but just like when we're doing simple complex with anything, hair is the same way, where if we've got our head, one side, I'm going to have it nice and simple, and then the other silhouette is going to be more complicated. And even when I start chopping shapes into stuff, you can start with a simpler curve and then cut in from there. All right, is there anything I want to tweak here? Let's have a look. Oh yeah, I want this arm to angle in a little bit. Right, and think about the psychological effect of certain things that you're doing, right? So I had the arm kind of going straight down, which was kind of like a cooler effect, but now I angled the arm in a little bit and she's clasping her hand. And so that feels a little bit more like an innocent thing, or like more shy kind of pose. And also I'm gonna work a little Clip Studio magic, just move this down slightly. Okay, cool. So form-wise, what do we got here? I'm going to draw this off to the side. Okay, you can imagine this. First, we have like a backwards tilt to that form. I'm rounding edges of that form, carving into it so that it feels a little bit more organic. And then the pelvis is tilted forward, or really almost kind of straight up. And that's also just another trapezoid. And those two are kind of sandwiched together. In practice, like when I'm practically drawing, I don't separate those forms. I will just draw them as one continuous object. But that's the idea. That's how they're coming together. The head is tilted to the side and down. So check this out for a moment. If it was to the side and back, we'd be seeing underneath, right? We'd be seeing the chin, and this ellipse would be curving upwards. But on the contrary, I have the head tilting down, so we're seeing the top plane of the head a little bit. And then let's see, this leg sloped in. Shape-wise, everything is tapering, right? We always have to keep in mind that gesture. The legs in general will angle in, and then at the foot angle out. Cool. And then let's see our arms again, those cylinders, we're looking at them in side view, so there's not much going on here. And in case you wanted to draw robots, this is a perfect way to start. Just turn everything into blocks. Cool. Yeah, and in general for you guys, I think taking a character model sheet and then approaching it that way, or starting with a character model sheet and then putting it in new poses is a great way to get used to shape design and get used to, you know, trying to essentially do what an animator does, because most of the time you're going to be using character model sheets from a show or whatever you're working on.
James,
Mhm.
how do you kind of reconcile tapering the limbs, especially the legs?
What? How do I reconcile? What was that?
Of tapering the limbs with like drawing like muscular quads and calves. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, we talked about this in the feedback. So let me show you for a moment. So think of the primary shape. Let's just say this is our primary shape of our leg. I'm making it a really muscular leg. It's got to like fit into this thing, right? Then I'm going to start carving into the shapes to get more nuance to the leg. So that's kind of how I break it down, whereas I have a primary shape which has to taper, or a primary shape that tapers down towards the ankle, and then within that I'm going to start carving into it to find my final shape. Another situation is, you know, maybe some artists or some character designs will be just super duper simple. I was looking at this one in feedback section. I love the way the anatomy is super detailed up top and then tapers down to very, very simplified legs. I think that's badass. That being said, I think if you have a general idea for what your overall shape is, like in this one, let's just say this is our overall gesture for the leg. From within this, I'm gonna cut and then add some nuance to that. What's the nuance going on here? We have the thigh, then a little overlap for the knee, or maybe I'll just draw a line on the center. Then we've got this gesture that goes out, in, and then out again. How did I learn that? By looking at this exact character design that I'm referencing. For me, that's sort of how I picked up on these nuances of shape design and how people turn those, turn anatomy into something that's more appealing. The other thing they do here in this character design is they allow the cloth folds to really, really break the silhouette, and I think that's super interesting. There's a little cloth on the boot that just totally breaks the silhouette, and that's a huge part of character design, is finding what parts of the cloth are going to break the silhouette. So anatomically speaking, there's not too much going on when you're drawing, but you're getting an understanding of the anatomy based on things like overlap, some of this internal line work, and just the tapering, right? You know, the shapes are more muscular towards the base of a limb. So for example, all the hamstrings and quadriceps are up here on the top portion of the leg, and then it gets more tendinous down towards the base. Same here, the body of the gastrocnemius is up here and then gets more tendinous down towards the bottom. You could learn that in a few ways. You know, what we were doing last time where you're drawing over figures, or also just once you're armed with that knowledge, look at how artists are applying that and sort of imitate their shape design. For me, I find a little bit more of the shape design imitation to be more useful, but both approaches are important. All right, so if we're drawing over this form, she's got a belt that's got to wrap up and over. That was a terrible version of that. Anyway, so as this form turns and angles down, the ellipses that are going to wrap around are going to change their angle, right? Up here where the body is tilting back, I'm angling up on that ellipse. In the center, when it's changing, it's just flat because you can imagine seeing that cylinder in side view. And then down here, it's curved down. So depending on where the belt is resting is going to affect where that's showing up, or what kind of ellipse I'm going to draw. And unfortunately, her belts are at an angle, so that changes things a little bit too. Cool, but yeah, everything's got to go up and over, right? You should, not that you need to do it when you're drawing, but you should be able to trace or follow the path of that belt all the way around the form. If you can't do that, then those ellipses are probably off, and it's important to check that, right? You want to feel as though that form could completely wrap around, maybe even break the silhouette to show that it's wrapping around, right? I'm breaking the silhouette there. Right, those wrapping lines in the character design, she's got a little bit of a color change in the sock. That helps me get a sense of the perspective because it just functions as a wrapping line for these cylinders. That's why it's important to do that, but you want to do it in ways that are subtle, ways that help convey the character design, but still look cool. Or sorry, help portray the perspective, but still look cool and somewhat subtle. All right. She's got these funny ellipses, or she's got like completely circular glasses. So I'm using the ellipses from the glasses, right? The head is I'm always thinking, to some degree, I'm thinking about forms, and her head is angled down towards the camera, right? So in this case, the minor axis of my ellipse is going to be these lines that are coming off of it. Sorry, the ones that are going towards my left vanishing point. Another way to think about it is the ellipse has to have a minor axis that's like perpendicular to that form. I don't know if that, oops, I don't know what just happened there. That might have just overcomplicated things, what I just said, but okay, what else is going on here that's worth noting? Things like ellipses and wrapping lines, super valuable. Here in the shoulders, those ellipses, like if you took an ellipse and then tilted it at an angle, so it's going up and over.
I have a question, James.
Sure.
The right leg where you drew an overlap for the knee kind of feels, I don't know if like, okay, there you go. As I feel like with the foot facing the other direction kind of threw me off if that was intentional.
This was intentional. So the knee is actually facing forward.
Mhm.
This foot should come a little bit more forward, but it is kind of a janky angle. Like if you look at the model, it is a
Oh.
little weird. That's not a good excuse necessarily. Like I said, we don't want to, that's not our goal. So if
Mhm.
I made something that looked kind of shitty, I made something that looked kind of shitty.
Mhm.
Maybe this would work. I typically will do that overlap of the
Of the knee, yeah.
yeah, I like to do that.
Like I like seeing it too, but it threw me off when I saw how the feet was facing the other direction. Like
Oh,
what?
because it's facing forward and not yeah, my intention was to show that, just like to add that twisting. It is,
Mhm.
let me show you what I'm looking at. The foot is coming
Oh,
from the bird,
now that makes sense why you did that initial.
but if it doesn't look good, it doesn't look good. So that might be something we want to address. Let's try it the other way. Right? Our goal here today isn't just do what we see, but if that is the case, if I do change that one, I'm going to change this one to come towards us.
Mm.
So I always like to have that contrast of where the feet are.
Mm-hmm.
So if this one's going out to the side like we just changed it, I'm going to make this one come forward. And that might be cooler. Okay, I'm going to move the head a little bit. I'm going to angle it more towards us. on the note of simplifying stuff as well, you know, when things are far away from the camera, like in this case, I'm not going to draw a super duper detailed version of the hand or something, right? I will sort of break it down into the shapes that I'm seeing. A lot of times I kind of think of it like almost like a mitten shape, with this being the pointer finger and this being the thumb. I kind of start from there. And then for the fingers, I break them down not into 3, but I break them down into 2. And if you could just imagine the letter Z, but it gets just tapers down. That's what I think about the thing about doing the fingers. Now they will get foreshortened at times, you know, depending on the overlap. But that's one thing that helps, is that letter Z. All right, now our eyes are kind of, or she's kind of far away, so we use somewhat simplified shapes. Never look at the camera. You know what would be even lazier? Just lightly indicate the shape. Right, just super delicate, even though I kind of fucked up there. All right. So even if you want to, you know, clean up your line work, I would say go in a couple passes, right? It doesn't need to be perfect all in the first go of things. Any questions before we continue? We're gonna do some more. Okay, let's do a little bit closer up. In general, if you want to do things like indicate more of the facial expression, indicate more detail, yeah, about expression, that kind of stuff, I would suggest bringing your camera in closer. So let's do one of those. We'll still continue from reference and then we'll move on from there. So if you're gonna indicate more details about your character, draw bigger. That's like the number one thing, right? Because I've had, you know, I've had trouble in the past, and I've had students that will try to draw all this detail, but then they'll be drawn super small. So let's just start with only do half the body. Again, we're going to push everything. We're focused on the gesture, even though we're going to play with the facial expressions and that kind of thing. Still going to push that pose. This one is a little bit more, I guess, orderly in the way that I'm approaching it, but it needn't be that. You could still be super duper loose. Okay, let's talk about this a little bit before we go any further. Okay, in my rough pass, I'm already starting with a little bit of shape design. You don't necessarily need to do that. I think the more you the more you work, the more you're going to start to like group shapes, or sorry, group steps together. So in this case, I've got a little bit of shape design going on in the arms and the body. Let's see what else we have here that's important. Again, that main form of the torso. I'm emphasizing that line of action. Body's leaning over to the right, more complicated on the right. Shoulder tilt and pelvis tilt are clearly demonstrated there, right? I'm even using some character design elements like the crotch, the hips, and the shoulder line to help get that across. You can still add some more anatomy like that triangular trapezius there, but you want that to read that main flower sac of the body. Okay, what about the head? I didn't talk about the head yet. I personally, I sort of ascribe it to the Loomis head, but I don't necessarily think it's just the Loomis head. So we'll draw this in a few angles. Probably seen this sort of thing before. Just starting with a ball. I'm making a note for the eye line, and then I'm bringing that shape down to make the chin. That's the sort of thing you can tweak that a lot. Here, let me talk about that for a second. So depending on how you want to play with your shape design, you could bring that chin down a lot and use a boxier shape to make it more a more masculine shape, right? So there's no set way of, or set distance that this needs to be at. As you turn that in 3/4, now we start to see that center line shift from center to whatever direction we're headed in. So if I'm, in this case, I'm rotating it clockwise, now that center line shifts to the left. And those points at which the chin meets have to shift to the left. And then once we're in full profile view, we see that fully in profile. The head is longer in profile than it is in front view or 3/4. And I think one of the things I saw in a lot of the figures were people making the length of the head in front and 3/4 the same as when you're looking at it in profile view. And so I think be cognizant of that. There's that big old cranium in the back of your head, which takes up a lot of space, right? The sort of front portion of the face goes about halfway. And then you've got this big old cranium in the back. So be careful of your proportions. I like to think of it, in front view, it's much more rectangular. And then 3/4, I almost repeat the exact same shape, maybe a little bit wider, but then just shift that center line over. Cool. Yeah, now that we're doing a more close-up view, I can draw a little bit more details on the character face. And then we'll add some platforms after this one. Do we have questions so far? Doing a lot of stuff, so questions are always welcomed. This class is for you and not for me, even if it's not related to the topic. Actually, you know what? I'm going to use some of the shape. Yep.
So, like, when we're doing the homework, you know, you've got like the more polished one on the left, and then you've got like the rough version you're doing now.
Mhm.
Which one would you kind of like rather see us like do?
I mean, honestly, I think I would, if you're having trouble, and I think if I've given you feedback and the poses are like kind of stiff, I care more about this,
Okay.
right? But don't give a shit about what I want, right?
Okay.
This is about you getting better at drawing, right? So whatever I want doesn't really matter. So I think part of that is identifying what you think you personally need to work on. So if you're doing your drawings and you're like, wow, I'm finding that my drawings aren't emphasizing the weight as much as I want them to, then that's a good sign that focusing on these rougher passes are more important. Or if you're like, hey, I want to try to bring my drawings to a more polished finish, but I'm having trouble figuring out how to do that, then, you know, take the time to bring them to a finish.
All right, cool.
Yeah, both are super important skill sets that aren't always, yeah, like getting good at one doesn't inherently make you good at the other. And my rule in art is never assume that you know how to do anything, because I keep finding that never is true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Painful but true.
Yeah, and that goes for everybody with the homework. If you don't want to do an assignment that I've given you, don't do it. Right? I mean, maybe have a good reason why why you're not going to do it, other than like, oh, I think I don't want to do work, which is, you know, that's also a fair enough reason. If you're like, hey, this class that I voluntarily signed up for, I don't want to do the work. I'm not going to get upset.
I have a question that is kind of related to this.
Sure.
There is a concept in animation called solid drawing.
Yes.
I never understood what that meant.
We've been talking about solid drawing quite a bit for most of this class. Anytime I'm using volumes or making reference to things in cylinders and spheres, that's solid drawing.
Okay.
And so, yeah, all of this stuff where I'm using center lines to demonstrate what's going on. It's called solid because essentially what I'm doing here is I'm making almost like a 3D model of a thing, right? So if I draw a cube and I draw through that form, meaning I'm drawing the sides that you can't see, that's a solid drawing. If I do
Okay.
that, yeah, if you do that same concept, but with any form, which is something that if we're, you know, struggling with solid drawing, that's still, I think taking the time to rotate organic forms is incredibly important. I could quite literally make an entire class just based on doing that. Part of why I'm continuing on past solid drawing is, you know, you guys are going to have this indefinitely. And I've got a lot of resources already available on drawing forms. So I want you guys to be able to look back at this and not be like, okay, I get it. I know how to draw a cylinder. I don't care. How do I draw a person? So
Okay.
yeah, so that's part of why if it feels like if you're uncomfortable with solid drawing and it's like somewhat rushed, that's totally understandable. In that case, my suggestion would be to, I can give you some other assignments that would be valuable. Things like what we did in the first week where we were rotating organic forms is incredibly important. And in my animation class, we did an entire session on just taking the character mannequin and rotating that in 3D space.
Yeah, okay. Might want to revisit that.
Sure, yeah, and I would highly suggest that same exact thing for everybody in the figure drawing as well. Unfortunately, there is a, like, as a teacher, you have to decide what to talk about and devote time to, as it can be quite difficult to sort of make that decision. But I think solid drawing is one of the things that you can, there's so many resources on how to do it that I think you can take a lot of this information and then apply that in concert with the solid drawing fundamentals.
Okay.
Yeah, no problem. And yeah, I'm sorry. I did sort of like, there were some solid drawing stuff that I maybe moved too quickly through just because there were, it seemed like so many people were comfortable with that in the homeworks. But yeah, everybody's always at different spots, so it can be somewhat difficult.
Mm.
The general idea is everywhere where I'm taking things like the arm. Here, let me actually just draw the mannequin one more time. Oops, sorry, my program keeps doing this where it's freaking out. Right, essentially for the torso, I'm just taking this trapezoidal shape and rotating that in space using the center line and an understanding of this ellipse degree. And I can share with you guys some resources that I did with the animation class on rotating forms. There's a bunch of stuff. I have a bunch of stuff on the YouTube channel about it as well. So definitely look there as well. It is one of those things that sort of will constantly rear its head though. Okay, so I have the character model here, and I'm using the character model to get things like the eye shapes, all that kind of stuff. So I always suggest working with a character model, even if it's one that you made up. Sometimes I'll do that. I'll just I'll draw up my own character model and then practice posing that character. I feel like I tilted that head a little too much. Yeah. Again, do some Photoshop magic. if I'm, doing this traditionally or working in a sketchbook, you know, I'll tend to just draw it lightly in pencil. And then when I'm cleaning up my lines, I'll usually go over them in ballpoint pen. I was shared some of those traditional sketches from this weekend. And that's kind of the approach I use. And then either I'll ink in my shadow colors or I'll use colored pencil for the shadows. And we're going to have a whole class talking about shadow shapes, so hopefully that will clarify some of those things. Shape design wise, I like to have folds break the character silhouette. Not always, sometimes it could be a little too much, but I'm doing a sort of line motif where I'll have my lines go down, they'll insert into something. And so we've got this sort of zigzag shape going on of the folds. I'm always keeping in mind that center line as well. And we have this tilt here in the side, so maybe I'll add some folding. It's important to pay attention to how other artists design their shapes too, right? A lot of times we had that whole lesson talking about, small, medium, large, that kind of thing. That's super important. Generally that idea of simple versus complex, having one side where the shapes are a little bit more simple and then one side where it's a little bit more complex. I also like thinking, especially with cloth, I think about, or cloth and hair, I think about C curves versus S curves. So in this case, if the wind was blowing to the right, I'm using a nice, more of a C curve on the left side, and on the right, I'm using an S. So keeps the contrast between those going. All right, and one leg is going straight down, so I'm using that vertical ellipse for the wrapping line on the stocking, and this one is coming forward, so I'm took that form and rotated it back. Right. Don't be afraid to let shapes break the silhouette as well. Super interesting when they do. Shape design, I mean, we've been talking about it, but shape design is something that's this sort of balance between finding where to omit details and where to include details. Okay, pardon my shitty hands here. All right, so that's, kind of the approach about how to take things and start loose. You can start way looser than that too. Even that has like a lot of information, but be messy and then work your way towards cleaning it up. We'll talk about it in the I think 2 classes from now, but then adding things like shadow and those colors are going to make it, it's just going to add so much form to your characters. All right, any questions so far?
Because you focus primarily on animation, when you're sketching, you're primarily visualizing the forms as opposed to the light.
Yeah, and I think that should apply to a lot of things. I mean, when I'm doing like a more classical style drawing, I would definitely think a lot about the shapes of light and dark. That'd probably be my main focus. But both mindsets are incredibly useful. It's not as though they're like in either they're not working independent of each other, you know? It's more of just like when I'm doing a drawing like this, I'm thinking more about the mannequin, and then I start to design my shapes of light and dark on top of that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, no
That makes
problem.
sense.
Yeah, so both are the same, and a lot of the principles are the same. It's more of just like how you execute it that's different, especially in animation when you're doing shadow passes. It's nearly identical to painting, except in painting you're going to use like soft edges, hard edges, lost edges, whereas in like animation you're mostly using hard edged shapes. So it's a very similar concept, and shape design applies to all those things, but let's not get carried away. Okay, cool, that's fun. Let's get platforms going, and we're gonna should do a little bit more rotations of mannequins and forms. Regarding the sort of cleanup, I think it's a good idea to look at other artists and get a sense of how they approach their cleanup. Even looking at Il Kwang's drawings, like there's some of that underdrawing there still, and his lines are probably a lot more shaky than you would think. And you see there's that follow through to those ellipses. It's great. It's great. It's not just it's not as clean as you might think. Leave that to a cleanup artist. All right, cool. Let's add a platform in. Oh, and I was drawing the same character, but in perspective. I forgot. All right, let's get our 3D model though before we get too carried away with ourselves. Oh, Mr. Buff Boy. All right, any pressing matters before we hop into this? I'm gonna take some coffee while you guys hopefully ask questions. Even if it's not related, just like what's on everybody's mind drawing wise? Like what's our greatest trouble so far?
James, I'm having a hard time picking picking like consistent shapes for the ribs and pelvis.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like every time I draw a mannequin like from reference, that the shapes for the ribs and pelvis are different.
So I think a good way to tackle that, and we can talk about that here, is doing character rotations. And one thing I had my students do in the animation class when they would do their character rotations. Okay, my layers are not working. Where are we? Oh, that's why. Yeah, so one thing I would have them do is sort of give yourself a guide. Like, okay, let's say we're drawing, actually I'll do it even thinner than that. Okay, we use just a trapezoid for the mannequin. Okay, in front view, we know it's got to be this wide. And you know, I'm thinking of the Aladdin body shape because it's what we talked about in the first class. In side view, we know it's somewhere around this wide. Right. So you know that throughout the course of rotating, it's pretty gradually going to change shape. Right. It's not a huge difference from front to side. Breaking that down into front and then 3/4 and then side view is a pretty good step. Another way, so let me just do this. Now from here, right, when we go into that 3/4 view, we've got to have that same shape halfway through, or that center line's got to be about halfway through. And we're subtly taking the distance closer to that profile view, which is the thinnest point. Now, that does obviously get more complicated when you're doing a full character. So we can do that we can practice this right now, and I'll get a pose, and we'll very loosely scribble in the pose at different angles. So don't undervalue the usefulness of being scribbly and messy. So I think that will, honestly, being super scribbly is kind of what helped me figure out proportions in the first place. I'm gonna get a new one of these. Material, where am I looking at? Why is my brain not working? Oh, there we go. Cool. Lower the opacity on this. Okay, so I'm just gonna draw this boring guy, this boring muscle boy. And I'm not really gonna change the, I'm not really gonna mess around with the pose right now. I'm just gonna try to draw it and get used to putting it at different angles and trying to maintain consistency. So here in our front view, let's make that head a little smaller. Remember, head size is what tells us all the scale. So if you make the head too big, it's going to make your character feel smaller. If you want your character to feel smaller, give them a big head. Right? Super loose, super messy. My feet are almost following the vanishing lines, right? And although we can't see it right now, right, I'm seeing the top plane of the feet.
Sorry, James, how did you bring that perspective lines in Clip Studio Paint?
It's a thing called, it's a material I downloaded. I forget what it's called. It's like Top Guide or something. I don't know what it stands for, but it's super good. I can link it in our Discord.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, no problem. So think about this, right? We want to get comfortable manipulating forms and organic shapes. I'll just starting here, I'm going to draw cylinders at different heights, right? Higher up it goes, the more circular it's going to get. So the same thing happens as when we're drawing the figure as well. Just going to leave that there as a reference. And if you notice as I'm drawing, I'm not being so precise about this, right? If you go in some early perspective books, they'll really hammer this home where you've got to draw a square and then have the perfect circle that fits within it. I've kind of spent a lot of time practicing that, and if perspective is challenging to you, I highly, highly, highly suggest taking the time to get used to that kind of stuff. This will go alongside that practice, right? Is, with all this, I'm just loosely scribbling in the character. It's kind of hard to, I'm not even having like, it might not even be the exact perspective. So that's part of making perspective intuitive, is learning how you can sort of mess around with things like that. Okay, now let's rotate this guy in side view at the same camera length or same camera height. Right, and I'm using reference here, right? It's slightly different camera angle, but don't worry about it right now. Just using reference, drawing the same character, same pose twice in a row. The only perspective grid you need. Ah, that makes sense. I couldn't help but read it in Andrew Tate's voice saying top G, because it's yeah, you get it. That fucking guy. Okay, now in side view, look what's gonna happen. All right, I've placed the first foot down, but we're going back towards the vanishing point. When we're getting to the part where we learn Bugattis in perspective. Oh shit. Please no. Right, and all these perspective lines are going to affect the gesture. But just being loose and scribbly makes it so much more intuitive. Right, this line is going to direct us to where the next shoulder is going to be. Move that head forward just slightly. Also, I realized I didn't make him buff. Let's make him buff. So another part of that is spending the time to rotate organic forms. I think in class 1, we talked about doing that rotation. I think if you get like an animation program or set up a timeline in your in Clip Studio or Photoshop, just practice doing those 3 steps and start with boxes, rotate those, then move on to cylinders, and then move on to more organic shapes. And we can break these apart shape by shape. So this trapezoid shape for the body, you want to learn to draw that same shape, but at different angles. So the further down we go, the more, once we go down into the depths, I'm going to see more of the top plane of this. I'm going to keep in mind those same inflection points. All right, the same inflection points. But we're going to see more of the top plane of that. Now, it is just the sort of thing that requires some sort of rote memorization, or not rote memorization, but iteration of that practice. But I think when you draw the way I'm doing it here, it's pretty easy to get a lot of practice, because I'm not very concerned about making this perfect. I'm just concerned about getting it to work. I'm not worried about trying to get that gesture proportion and having the character fit in 3D space.
So would it be helpful to like plot organic shapes in like a box and then practice rotating that, kind of like what you did in your dynamic sketching video, I think it was?
I think that's a useful technique to be able to do. I think it's a little less useful in terms of drawing practically, but I wouldn't want to dissuade you from doing it because I find that it helped me understand 3D space a lot better.
Okay.
Yeah, I think a lot of those things like the early perspective stuff in Scott Robertson's books and all that kind of stuff helped get a good understanding of how forms fit in 3D space.
Where does that fit into like your growth? Like, should that be like something you just slowly do over time, or is it something you've put in like a month early on to build that out so that you can build on top of?
I think it should go concurrently, right? Like as you're drawing, and there's some people in the class that when I looked at the work, their perspective was super on point, and some people were struggling with it. So if you're drawing and you're going, okay, I'm finding that as I'm doing this, it doesn't make a lot of sense in perspective. And once I start doing camera angles that are tougher for me, then I'm losing that perspective and form. Then definitely start simple, rotate. Like I said, start with rotating boxes. Doing it in an animated capacity is helpful. Get comfortable doing what I just did here, which is I'm just drawing cylinders as they go through the horizon line. I think if it's very difficult for you to build up these or gradually change the degree of these ellipses, then I think this is a relatively simple exercise that's really useful. Like it's not a very complicated exercise compared to drawing a full person. Like I think you guys have done harder exercises already.
I think it's the completely changing the camera angle where like I immediately panic. I'm like, oh no.
Wait, what was that? I missed that.
I think it's the completely changing like the camera angle where it's like the simple forms that, because we did in the animation class, we did the cylinders and the cube and stuff. It's just the more complex forms and I guess rotating that gesture in space.
It's it is super challenging. Don't get me wrong. For me, I got more mileage out of doing something like this where I would loosely scribble in with a perspective grid and start to get used to that than I did rotating organic forms.
Okay, so instead of rotating the organic forms or even doing the blocky boy in this, just do the scribbles because it's kind of fast, more iteration.
I love it. It's so much faster to get to iterate. We're getting like you're just getting so much more done because think about what we're practicing here. We're practicing gesture, even though this one on the right sucks. We're practicing gesture. We're practicing proportions because we're maintaining these proportions, right? The head height, and we're keeping the head height relative to the body somewhat constant. And we're practicing perspective because we're putting these characters in an environment. So I find that doing this scribbly form of sketching is much better for getting used to this sort of thing. And I would do exactly how I'm doing it here. Just grab yourself a perspective grid and then try to sketch characters in that. I'm going to point out one thing that's going to happen here, though. It's going to get a little bit confusing. So in the first case and in the profile case, both of them had platforms that led directly back to our center vanishing line, right? Made it super duper simple. Now, when I rotate in 3/4, we're actually going to turn the perspective grid. We're not going to change the horizon line. That's going to stay constant throughout. But what's going to happen is we're going to shift where the vanishing point is. And if you guys remember back to some of the earlier perspective stuff, we talked about that a bit. That comes along with rotating boxes, where as you rotate it, you're creating a new set of vanishing points each time. So that's what we're doing here. We're rotating that character, or sorry, the platform And so now those shoulders are going to go down at an angle. I'm telling you, scribbling, probably the most valuable tool an artist has. It's the best. Okay, now the knees are at the horizon line, so everything flattens out there. The way we're drawing this, oh, actually, I'm going to make that correction in 1 second. That way you can get into I can explain my mindset for a moment. Okay, so let me talk about a correction I was just about to make, but I want to explain it. So I was about to move his head over to the right, and I'm still going to do that. But why was I going to move his head over to the right? Not because I want to move his head on his body to the right, right? I'm not like decapitating him and shifting his head over. But in this 3/4 view, if I want him to move forward, if I want his head to move forward, I have to move the head to the right. So that's the weird thing about perspective, is that certain directions, that it's all off. Certain directions will indicate a change in 3D space. Just don't like the position of that arm. But the other valuable thing about scribbling is you get used to capturing angles of the limbs, like I'm capturing here, in a way that allows you to just focus on the pose and a little less so on being a cool artist. I want you to think, I'm so not cool that I'm forced to draw like a child. That's what I want you to think when you're doing this. I want you to be like, wow, James thinks so low of me that he thinks I'm at a toddler's level of drawing. And then I want that anger. I want that anger to boil up inside your head so much that you draw better than anyone ever has drawn ever before. The frustration is going to motivate you.
I actually appreciate you utilizing scribbling, as you call it, as a skill set, because I've run into people that used to call it chicken scratch, and they'd be like, don't do that. You only confident lines all the time, and I'm just sitting there going, but scribbles are useful, dude.
Yeah, they're the best. It's super useful. And even when I'm actually, for the most part, when I'm sketching in my sketchbook, I'll draw like this. I'll just use like a really light line weight. And on the tablet, I don't have to do that because I can just like lower the opacity like this and sketch over it. But in my sketchbook, I'll work this way, and then I have like a sick ass eraser that I just erase back, and I've got something to build upon. Yeah, it's super useful. And for the longest time, my ego was like, nah, you can't do that. Don't do that. You're stupid. And then it turned out just doing silly shit, not letting myself sketch.
There is value to having confident lines, but I agree with you that the scribbles also have value, and I think a lot of people miss out on that. They're so focused on it has to be confident, it has to be perfect, and gestural and all this other stuff that scribbling is also gestural.
Exactly. And when you do your scribbles, it's like the most one-to-one connection I think your brain has to the paper, because it's just like you're so connected to the paper, you're not even thinking about the mechanics of lifting your hand up. You're just going. And I super value that. I think it's very important. Proportionally, I didn't do the best job of keeping the proportions here. But I think try to keep in mind as you're doing it, try to keep in mind what are the main elements that are selling your character's proportions. So in the first one, I had this really broad shoulder compared to tapered waist. It's almost like, yeah, like that kind of shape. So as I'm rotating that, I'm keeping in mind that I want the shoulders to be more broad than the waist. We can use things like, actually it looks stupid now, going back. We can use elements like the ellipses on the side there to give us that perspective. And notice my minor axis to that ellipse is going to follow that vanishing line back to my vanishing point. Cool. Okay, so that's some scribblies. Let's try some more. Let's move our camera. Okay. What happens here? Oh my gosh. All right. Now there's two ways of imagining this, right? But I want you to think about, maybe this is somewhat of an arbitrary distinction, but I don't think it is. So there's two ways to change what we're seeing. So we had our camera about here in the first case. Now, if I'm sitting in my chair and I look down, the horizon line hasn't moved, but I'm seeing further and further below the horizon line. Like my visual field is down here versus up here. Whereas the only thing that's going to change where the horizon line is if I physically move the camera up or down. Again, that might be too early of a distinction to make. It will make more sense if I use a 3D model with an environment. So maybe we shouldn't worry about that just yet. Let's get these guys out of here. Cool. All right, we're going to lift our camera up. Now what happens when we lift the camera up? We're going to get a lot more overlap, and maybe I'll even lift it more. Okay, so here's the big thing that's going to happen. We're going to see a greater distance between feet. We're going to get overlapping shapes. And we're going to see the top planes of things. So you can imagine if we just drew a little box down here, right, we'd be seeing the top plane of the box. Also notice I didn't change the camera lens at all, but look how much more parallel these lines are, right? The further down you go, the more parallel that platform is going to look. We're going to start with little boring pose. Then we'll gradually build that up, make it more interesting. Now there's some camera angles that don't emphasize something or some of the gestures well. So for example, the sort of back tilt of the shoulders isn't really emphasized all that well at this camera angle. In fact, it's one of those camera angles that really, really can mess up gesture. But that doesn't mean we're not going to do it. But that is something to think about in animation, does a camera angle help sell a pose or is it actually detracting from a pose? And there are camera angles that do that. This is scaring you? Like a primal fear? Uh-oh, that's not good. It's just scribbling. Don't worry if if you make mistakes. I'm so short, I never get to see people at this angle. You've never stood on a staircase. It's a shame. Not to call you out. I liked your joke. I just had to ruin your joke. If you're at negative height and you stand on a staircase, you're still seeing people's feet. There you go. Cool. So this camera angle that I picked, I'll tell you why it's not my favorite. I made a point earlier about if you're going to make a decision, you should probably commit to that decision, right? So in this case, we have a top-down camera angle, but it's not top-down enough that we're going to get a ton of overlap. We're starting to see a little bit of overlap with the head and the shoulders. There's not so much, right? That's not to say never do this camera angle. You can definitely do it at times, especially if you got a cool environment. But something like this camera angle, we get way more overlap. That sign can't stop me because I can't read. Damn. All right, so yeah, whenever I'm practicing some sort of pose and perspective, it's a good idea. Give yourself a little cube to follow along with. Right, so one way to help sell that there's a camera looking down, we're gonna push that shoulder. It's gonna overlap even more. We're gonna get way, way more foreshortening. Look at these scribbly arms. Right, imagine you're looking down at the floor. We've got these diagonals on the vertical. I'm gonna give him the same, that stop sign can't stop me energy. Give him the, okay, so when you're drawing these people, it's nice to work with the grid because you can really get a sense of that perspective underneath. Let's draw the grid for this guy. So we can see the grid, these lines become way, way more parallel the further down that camera is. And the same in the opposite direction, right? If you lift if the character is high above you and we're looking up, it's going to get more and more parallel. Okay, what else happens? We're seeing the top plane of the shoulders. The eyes and nose are all down here. So everything has shifted. right? It's a little bit harder, or a lot of it harder to, capture some of those poses and gestures, but you can play around with it, get used to messing with things and see how they change in 3D space. I think if you keep in mind this idea or this concept of shapes that overlap, it'll really help. The biggest issue I see when people start doing this sort of thing where they push the camera higher and higher is they'll tend to elongate the body a lot more rather than let shapes overlap. Now, this pose or these poses have gotten increasingly foreshortened, right? As we're tilting that camera up, the overall like visual length of the character changes, right? But notice that I'm not changing the scale very much. Maybe a little bit on the legs, but still not changing the scale all that much. Of like his head is not massive, right? It's relatively in proportion. So again, that camera being far away gives us a sense that the perspective, or sorry, the scale is like relatively normal. All right, cool. Let's compare that to the other one. Cool. I can see why I've been trying. Yep, sorry.
What's the difference of just panning up and then rotating the camera up, like orbiting up?
Okay, so check this out. Check this out. Let's say what creates the angles around you, like these lines, is their physical distance to you, not what you're seeing, right? So as I'm sitting in my room, all these angles exist around me, even if I'm not seeing them. And all I can see is this circle or this, this visual field. When I tilt my head up, I'm looking up further in this grid. So now I'm seeing everything angled down, seeing the ceiling, right? You guys are here in the computer screen. My floor is down here. All right, does that make sense? So as my horizon line staying exactly here by my head, but tilting it, if I look down on the floor, I'm looking down here. If I'm looking up, I'm looking all the way up here. Now, if you move the camera physically up, now things change, right? So if instead of me tilting my head up and down, I like physically move the camera up and down. 1 second, let me get rid of that. So if I physically move the camera up, well, let's say that this was my computer. Now my computer is going to be down here and the ceiling might be here. This is, not a great drawing, but you get the point that as I move the camera, now I'm changing the environment. So what you'll notice in a lot of animations is they'll have one background painting, and then as a character moves around in it, they'll do exactly what I did with that blue circle. They'll have that move around the environment that's already in place. It's a much more complicated shot that involves background animation if the camera itself is moving. Which people do that. I can show you examples of both of those. But the only thing that's going to change the positioning of the horizon line is where you put the camera. The tilting it up and down is not going to change the horizon line. I hope that makes sense. I'm praying that makes sense. I'll show you some examples after too in animations where the camera's moving and so the environment has to be animated. Most of the time, if they're going to move the camera, a lot of times people will use 3D models because it's a much greater challenge.
Okay, so sorry. So if you're orbiting like around, like like in like Blender and stuff, you can like orbit the camera around.
Yeah, that's changing the That's
That
the
would be the
camera's
same.
moving here.
That would be the same thing as panning up and then just moving and then just tilting downwards, essentially.
This is different. Like orbiting is different because you're both moving the camera and rotating and tilting it. So it's actually a more complicated movement.
Okay.
So like when I'm orbiting like this, it's not just the camera sitting in one spot and swiveling around. I think it's the camera physically moving around. So it's a little bit more complicated. I think this kind of gives a similar result. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm trying to think about that. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what the most 3D modeling programs, when they orbit, I'm pretty sure it's also moving the camera. So just be aware of that. It's not just like sitting in the same spot and then rotating. Easy way to figure this out too, or get more comfortable with this, get out your phone, get out a camera, and then sit there and just like take videos. You could film and then draw over those films if you want to work on the perspective that way. Get engaged with the environment. It's really, really helpful. Ramimo likes videoing strangers. It's pretty fucked up, but they're in a public space. That's what happens. Yeah, get engaged with the environment. It really makes it so much more intuitive. Like once I got a fisheye lens, started taking photos and like interacting with it that way, it made a lot more sense to me. Because otherwise it's kind of this like foreign concept that doesn't make all that much sense until you utilize it.
I feel like I'm so close, but there's like a couple things every now and then I run into, and I'm like, oh wait, how do I do that?
Yeah, it's confusing. It really is. And trust me, I struggle with fisheye lens all the time. And my mindset with that is just to think about it abstractly, which we're going to talk about next week, and that will hopefully help you, because that kind of shit is really confusing. But on the note of confusing, let's get to the camera looking up. So now our character is super tall. We're looking up. In general, by the way, if you're going to do the problem when you're drawing, it looks cool to have your camera really low looking up. It looks badass, but it's a challenge to draw. So let's try to get that. Well, cameras are the best. Again, I'm doing this sort of thing where I'm just drawing in cylinders. I'm eyeballing it. You could, if you want, follow back the vanishing lines, and then draw an ellipse in there to really understand, or to make sure that you're getting it right. Characters are pretty organic, so don't have to worry too much. Yeah, see, I fucked up a little bit. That degree should be even more circular. And then the higher up you go, now these lines have to start angling. And then here at the horizon line, it's relatively flat. Cool. Y'all are silly in the chat. All right, let's start with our 3/4. And mind you, I am well aware that we were talking earlier about pushing the gestures and really trying to emphasize the gesture. I know that that's super hard when you're also adding in camera angles to it. That's like another level on top of it. That's why we're taking baby steps. We're not going for perfect drawings right now. We're just kind of scribbling stuff out there, just trying to get used to it. I'm gonna put the camera pretty low. The lower the camera gets, the more of a straight line between the feet it's going to be, regardless of where they are on the platform. That kind of makes sense. There's just like so much less space to work with. So that's something to keep in mind. Starting in 3/4. Oh, you know what? just because I'm in the mood to have fun, I'm going to draw this One Piece guy. Why not? I want to have fun too. Not all about you guys all the time. Don't you guys ever care about what I want to draw?
James, do you watch One Piece?
You know what? I'm such a hypocrite because I have been talking all about One Piece and I have not watched a single episode of One Piece. However, I have watched enough compilations of Sakuga animation from One Piece that I feel like I deserve to draw as much One Piece as I feel like it. I'm really sorry. I know there's such like an avid fandom and I'm a terrible teacher. I know you're upset.
Yeah, the guy you're drawing is a super important character.
Yeah, I saw a bunch of animators animating him, and I'm like, that's a really badass character.
Kaido's name. Kaido.
It's just so daunting to get into it later because there's just so many episodes.
Yeah, I started watching it when I was like, for Christ's sakes, like probably 13 or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, you know what I mean? It's crazy.
Exactly. That's the problem. I didn't watch it when I was young. I didn't know. I wasn't aware. Nobody was here to tell me how good about One Piece or how good One Piece was.
I think it's about to outsell Batman for like the greatest comic book ever or something like that.
Oh, for real? That's
Yeah.
epic.
Or I think it did it already.
Epic.
I'm not-
Yeah, who cares about Batman? Who gives a shit about Batman? Get out of here, Batman. Oh, I'm a guy that's emo and is a vigilante. Who cares?
Andrew Tate would like Batman.
Yeah, very true, very true, very true. Okay, so let's talk about what I just did. So, not the coolest gesture, but luckily the character design is like tapered enough that it's kind of interesting anyway. Let's see. Let me actually move our vanishing point slightly. So it's kind of like that. So right now, the gesture I'm using, I didn't make it super complicated because I wanted it to be sort of easy to track where the vanishing points are. And for everybody, I would suggest this as well. Like, it's very difficult to get used to tracking organic shapes as their vanishing points. Or like, in this case, the right shoulder is directly across from the left shoulder, and it's super difficult to make sure all those lines map up correctly, right? So start doing these with just super neutral poses. And I promise you, the more you do it in this sort of loose, organic way, the easier it's going to get. But take note of how everything is following those vanishing lines, right? Except for the hands, because I fucked up. And we'll lift up his hand a little bit, right? Everything is going down, angling down towards that vanishing point. It can be challenging to get the gesture when you're doing, as we mentioned earlier, if I move something to the left here, I'm not just moving it to the left, I'm moving it physically back in space. Same if I like, say, let's draw a box for a moment, right? In this case, if I move something, like just say we have this point and I move it to the right, like this, just directly to the right, I've physically moved it back in 3D space. So that's where things get a little confusing, is that, objects, when you move them to the left or right in perspective, are moving through space and time. I don't know about time, but you get the point. So one of the exercises you can do for that as well, that's much easier than this, is taking planes, doing curves and tracking those curves through space. So taking these vertices, sending them over to the right side. Let's just say this is A, C, and we'll call this B. It's all that Scott Robertson fun stuff. If this is like completely unfamiliar to you, or this is a struggle, we can do a little bonus session. We'll talk about all this stuff. It's very useful to be able to do that because it's kind of one of the main skill sets required for shifting organic forms in 3D space. Okay, but once if you're a pro, you're super comfortable with that. You're like, I'm badass. I don't need Scott Robertson as a nerd. And you can start scribbling your characters over. Right? Now, one of the things that's happening is we still want to get that gesture, right? So to over exaggerate, there's this gesture to the feet. So the upper leg goes forward, lower leg goes back, foot goes out. So in this perspective, we've got to think about that like this. Right? We're seeing the top of this one, even though we're looking up at it, because I'm tilting that cylinder forward. If the leg was going straight up and down, it would look like this, where we'd be seeing the underside a little bit. But I'm physically rotating it forward. Right? You can imagine if the legs were just straight up and down, like stilts or something, it would look more like this. But now we've tweaked it. We've changed the angle. So that's how you're getting this gesture that I'm doing here. Let's add his epic horns too. And those also have to follow that vanishing line. All right, he's got a pretty complicated, he's got all these like complicated shapes, all this hair back here. In my head, I'm imagining all that hair as a semicircle, almost as if I drew it like, I'll do it over here. Imagining it like this shape, and then I'm just chopping into and out of that. That's kind of how I'm keeping track of the forms back here. And then you just got to add a bunch of triangles and a giant cape. Okay, let's do a back view. Keep that camera low. And like I said, the lower the camera is, visually the feet are going to be almost horizontal at that point. Everything's got to wrap around, right? We're also seeing underneath the chin. And everything from like the pectoral muscles, I don't just draw it horizontally across. I'm gonna wrap it around. It's got to wrap around the body. The shoulders are gonna kind of overlap the head a little bit. I do think I got to shift the head over to the right just a tad. Something like that. It's good enough. Works in my book. And again, getting used to doing gestures at complicated angles. Keep it loose and scribbly. Don't worry too much about making it look pro just yet. I promise you I won't get upset in your homeworks. I won't get mad. Okay, now in the front view, we don't have that same horizon line concern, or sorry, the same vanishing line thing that we're getting between shoulders, right? So you've got to find other ways to sell the fact that we're looking up at the character. It actually makes it a little more challenging, in my opinion, right? Because one of the main components that was helping sell that depth was everything following vanishing lines. But as soon as we get into the front view, we lose that, right? Because we're just looking directly at the character. So how the hell do you make it look like you're looking up at him? Well, key is what we just talked about with those ellipses that are wrapping up. And just like when we had our camera looking down, the more overlap that there is, or sorry, the higher up you look, the more overlap there's going to be in the forms. Still trying to keep in mind the shape, the overall width of the character, those inflection points, even though I'm scribbling. Right. To the student earlier that was saying you're having trouble rotating those forms and keeping it, that character design intact. I think if you try to loosen up like this, you probably would have a better bet of keeping that character design, because at least now when I'm drawing loosely, I can go back and be like, okay, well, that shape's messed up or that proportion's out of whack, and I can kind of play around with it until it feels right. Right, but if you don't allow yourself to be a scribbly mess, you're gonna have a real hard time. Okay, now everything from the legs to the arms, even if I rotate them outwards, we're looking at the bottom portion of that cylinder. And there's reference packs online of people wearing suits that have these like little wrapping lines. If you want to find that, that's not a bad idea as well. There's some on Pinterest, I think, of a person, he literally just painted black lines around their limbs and stuff. Or maybe it was black tape or something. And that helps you figure out how these ellipses, these wrapping lines work. But yeah, you can just imagine everything's going up and over. Eventually what happens if the camera goes, or if the character is above high enough, the chest is going to overlap the head. So you're not even going to, you're going to barely see the head. Maybe you'll just see the chin.
Hey, James, for this, when we're rotating this, not rotating, sorry, like when we're playing around with the camera, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about the gesture a while ago. This is where one of those instances where I don't even know like how the like the tilt of the pelvis and the it is going on, right?
Yes.
Because it's hard to kind of like get that when you're moving the camera around.
You're not wrong. You're not wrong. I will point out part of my thinking. And actually, I think I can clarify things. As world's best teacher, I think I can help you.
That's
Um,
we're here for that.
I'm in a cocky mood today. Yeah, no, I'm just being silly. Okay, so check this out. If we look at the hips at this angle, and let's say the hips are just going straight up and down, right?
Mhm.
I'm gonna just have the hips as though they're straight up and down. Kind of wrap up and over the way I'm drawing with that ellipse. Now check this out. If I'm gonna have him tilt forward a little bit, like I wanna, like we were doing before, if we're looking at eye level, the hips are going forward, pelvis is going back.
Yeah.
This ellipse, it's not going to be, we're not going to see it like this, where everything's angled down, but that idea will be in play. So what's going to end up happening is we're going to see less of the bottom, and it'll start to flatten out, or maybe it'll be like just flat because it's starting to angle towards us.
Okay.
So if I wanted to show that the hips are actually angled forward towards us and not, and sort of counterbalancing that, the back angle of the shoulder, or sorry, of the rib cage, I would flatten this line out a bit,
Mhm.
which I don't think that works at this angle. I do think we'd probably get more up
Yeah.
like this. So it's playing around with that to find something that works, right?
You
But
still have,
yeah,
I guess you still have to check whether or not like the drawing like looks good. You know
yeah,
the
if
principle.
it feels good, yeah, if it feels right, right? So if we really pushed this, like we wanted to really exaggerate it, we would probably start to see a subtle amount of that top plane,
Mm.
but not so much. And for anybody that's confused with that, just imagine you were wearing just imagine this as a belt, right? And when the person's standing upright at this angle, it all just curves up. And then as they tilt their pelvis towards you, that line's going to flatten out. And maybe if they break their back, it'll angle down. But essentially, all curves are now headed in the direction of curving upwards, if that makes any sense. Right here, the arm wraps are coming towards us, so we've got that ellipse right there. Right, so much of drawing characters in space is getting comfortable with 3D volumes, understanding how to rotate cylinders more than anything. And I do believe you guys have the those gum roads. I did talk about characters in 3D space. Hopefully that is also useful to you guys. But doing that practice of rotating cylinders, incredibly useful. Okay. Is there a question? Somebody's microphone came on. All right, let's do one last little one and we'll bring the character even higher up. Okay, but what happens if they're just so high up in the air that we're looking directly up at them? Now we've got a grid that's like almost parallel. We're breaking the program. I'm going to draw in the grid because I don't know why it's getting low opacity there. But the same concept in this case, right? We want to when I'm drawing somebody in this kind of angle, I'll usually start with the feet and then work my way up. Now everything's rotating up so much that it's like, take a cup and then look at the bottom of it, just hold it above your head. And it's like, everything's perfectly circular. They refer to this as the creep's eye view. It's a very creepy angle to be drawing, but it works if somebody's like doing some kung fu shit and they're flying through the air and they're above. So sometimes you got to use it. But everything is wrapping up and over. And what I'm going to try to do is overlap most of the neck. Yeah, most of the neck is going to be overlapped by the form of the rib cage and chest, and we're mostly seeing underneath the chin. So this is at a point where there's going to be like a clear physical separation between the rib cage and the neck.
Is it true that, like, this, obviously, like, in this situation, we're thinking of this us being below a standing character, and that's the perspective. But wouldn't these same principles apply if the character was maybe like lying down or something like
Exactly.
that?
Same thing. Perfect. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, you could also imagine this character just lying down. It's basically the same thing. Actually, it's not even basically the same thing. It is the same exact thing, except for the environment that's around them. Right, these are going back towards our center vanishing point. And these are vertical lines that are going up towards, I'll just call that the upper vanishing point. Haven't gotten a consensus on the correct terminology for that. Okay, so now everything's got to adjust, right? The way I'm drawing the feet has to be adjusted. I'm seeing almost like a footprint, right? And so for that shape, I imagine just like whatever the shape of a footprint would be, or in this case, I have the character designed to go from a little bit rounder towards the base. The foot itself is overlapping a lot of the leg above it. I'll draw some forms here so it makes more sense. We'll do this in blocky boy way. So I'm seeing the bottom plane of the foot, the leg as a cylinder, and everything is just foreshortening back in space. Right, you can obviously you could do this sort of foreshortening to the extreme where the feet are almost in line with the head, right? If you think directly under somebody. So all these rotations have their, like you can just keep going. And then we're seeing underneath the chin there. And then the horns, they kind of go forward on his head. Like if you're looking at him in side view. His horns kind of go forward like this and then back. So since they're going forward like this, they just go almost like straight up. Cool. Not the most thrilling pose, but gets the point across. Cool. So yeah, I definitely want everybody, as you're playing around and drawing your figures at different angles, keep it loose, keep it fun, keep it expressive. We're going to do figures at all these different camera angles, and we want to just get used to, using neutral poses for now. They can be super duper boring. Then as you get more comfortable, you're going to be a little bit more exploratory, and it will make more sense when you, once you're comfortable doing like a regular pose, then you're like, okay, let me now push a little bit further. I'll try a tilted pose in a weird angle. Then eventually that gets more comfortable. Now you're like, okay, now I can start to finish up some of these sketches, right? I don't need to keep them in a loose, kind of shitty way. So I think baby steps, baby steps. Any questions before we move on? What's confusing? What's not confusing? I just need an excuse to have a sip of coffee. I get it. You guys are going to give me the silent treatment. I get it. No, I get it. Don't worry. It's all good.
We just want you to have your coffee in peace.
Damn. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. You guys are kind souls. So yeah, I think I'm not ending the lesson. I'm just going to say for next week, I think we're going to do more complicated camera angles and action poses. Then after that week, I want to do cloth, and we'll finish up with lighting, because I think all those, we'll do lighting and line work as the last day, because that's all going to be dedicated towards how we finish things up. Right? Because lighting and line work is kind of like the finishing touch on the sculpture that is a nice drawing. All right. All right. The last thing I wanted to talk about was actually drawing faces. We've not really done too much of that. And I meant to touch on it in the second lecture, but I didn't really get a chance to. So let's talk about it today. Let me get my timeline feature going. Okay. Let's pull up a new character sheet. I'm just going to continue with the whole One Piece thing. I hope you guys don't mind. So no One Piece kick right now, despite having not watched the show at all. All right, we're going to start with, I'm going to use character sheet, and then I'm going to just rotate the form, and then we can start drawing characters or faces from reference. That way, y'all can draw whichever characters you would like. Okay, so let's start. I kind of alluded to it before, where the way I draw the character shape, I mean, for the most part, when I'm drawing, I will typically draw some sort of abstract shape and then use 3D forms to figure out how they fit in space. But let's start with just line for the eyes. I'll leave it there for now. Just basic. And I'll throw some ear shapes too, so it makes more sense. And I guess he can have a neck. I guess. I'll be kind enough to give him that. Okay. Now, I'm going to do basically a character rotation. And as I'm doing this, I'm trying to rotate the character's head around a center point. Imagine if you just put like a pin or something at the top of your head. It sounds painful. And we're going to rotate around that axis. So when I go into side view, the face is, or the head's going to be at its longest point because we have the cranium. But for the most part, it's going to be not too much longer. The neck is going to be around the same spot. How do we track shapes? I try to keep them, roughly around the same width here. And we're going to keep it loose at first. Okay, let's talk about this shape that I'm doing here for the profile view. Let's do a simplified version of it. Right. Ball, and from the front, I'm just dropping down a little bit, going back about halfway. And that halfway point is where the jawline is going to meet the neck. Right. Super duper basic version of head shape. You'll see in the Loomis version, he also uses an ellipse for the side, which will be more relevant in the 3/4 view. I'm adding some details like the nose and mouth. So you can imagine one other way to draw this. Start with essentially that straight line down from the ball, and then the main contours of the face we can sketch emerging from that. Cool. So if we follow the center line in front view, directly in center, profile view, it becomes the silhouette. And in 3/4, it's going to be halfway between those. So we can follow the chin as well. I'm rotating far enough that that far ear is going to be out of view. So that center line shifts over. This ellipse on the side of the head. I'll do the more constructive version on the right. So I'm starting with that sphere.
Bless you.
Thank you, thank you. Let's make that a little bit bigger. The ears, I don't want that to come up. Let's keep that in the same spot. Right, trying to maintain the height between those. Not perfectly matching his shapes, but we don't have to worry too much about that. Okay, now because of the way perspective works, let's have a look at the 3/4 view. So the mistake I'll tend to see is some people would draw the nose directly on this center line, but because that's a volume that's emerging from the nose, it's got to be to the left of the center, in this case because we're rotated to the left. Right? Front view, it's right there in front, and they do like a little shadow shape to indicate that. Little shadow shape and a dot. Right, and I'm just going to use the way the studio draws the character to keep that. Okay, this hair shape, right? When you're getting used to rotating characters in space, have identifying features that you know that you can use as anchor points. So the way I just drew this in the front, that little hair swoop comes across the center line. So I'm going to do the same thing here, but now the center line is shifted. Same for elements that break the silhouette. There's a couple little shapes that come off the head over here. I'm going to keep those relatively in line. You're getting existential dread? No, no, it's not what we want. This is not what we want in this class. What about regular dread? Regular dread is okay. And now this hair swoop is across here. Okay, so let's go back. If you've never drawn a head mannequin before or whatever, start with a ball, draw a center line through it. Keep it super duper simple. Then we're rotating in space. The degree of this ellipse on the side plane getting wider till you're in side view, where now it's a perfect circle. Okay, then the neck, I'm using sort of like a cylinder, but I'm bending that back slightly. Level 4, create a complete orbit around a pose. Hey, I've done it. I got a video on it. If I do it, that means you could do it. Y'all want to do figure drawings, but nobody wants to rotate forms in 3D space. So I'm attaching the cylinder to the neck. Do I know Ronnie Coleman? Yes, I do. This ain't nothing but a peanut. Joke's on you, I don't want to draw figures, but I want to draw characters. Dang. I don't know the difference entirely, but let's keep it. All right. Let's draw his eyes. He's got such ridiculous eyes. And on the note of finishing up a drawing, like it's a good idea to have like a benchmark for how you want to finish a drawing, right? Have a drawing off to the side or something. Like I'm looking at this drawing, he looks absolutely crazy there. But that's a good benchmark for how the colors are laid out, the line work, that kind of stuff. So give yourself something to refer to. Right? That shape's got to rotate in perspective just like ellipses, right? In front view, it's a circle or pretty circular, the eyes. As it turns, that degree changes. These type of anime eyes are, at least his, are kind of like almost like stickers on top of a shape. So it's almost like a flat object on top of the shape. So I'm not doing any like carving into or out of the form as I would do if it was like a realistic eye. I gotta curve the eyebrows because I don't know how they're making them not look creepy. I gotta say they're doing a decent job of it, despite the fact that his pupils are like just right in the middle of his head. It's crazy. Maybe he was always creepy. It's possible. The ear rests right on the bottom part of the jaw. Right, so here's that ellipse shape. I put the ear right there at the bottom. How did I know I don't watch it? That's a really good point. Yeah, I'm losing a little bit of the character design here. It's not the best. Right. It's got a bit of a sharper nose, so let's try to get that. Yeah, there we go. Right, and if you look at the shape of the eyes, here's that center line, and that ellipse degree gets flatter as it turns into profile view. Just think of cylinders. When I'm doing pencil sketch, I'll put in some shadows, especially the neck in front view. It's pretty hard to get a sense of depth. You can do that with line weight. You can do that with shadows. In animated hair styles, they'll tend to use hard edge shapes. So like I'm using very sharp shapes like this. If you're doing more, even like comic book styles will use a little bit softer shapes, but there's a lot of stylization you can do with the hair. I think that was apparent. I don't think you needed me to tell you that. I think that was pretty apparent. So there's that basic form. You can start to rotate into the back view. Right, and I'm tracking elements like the position of each hair shape as it goes back in space. Right, each thing is rotating around. And I'm trying to keep everything at the same level. So this eye stays at the same height. You could even, on this layer, like on a separate layer, you could draw little indicators so you know where everything is. Since this isn't an animation class, I'm not so concerned with you guys, really doing this super well. But it is one of those skills that's like so useful. I'm just going to say it's very useful. I'm not going to say you have to do it, but I will say that it's highly encouraged. Right? Don't worry about it being a smooth transition like super animated. What specifically is useful? Just doing these rotations and maintaining your character model as you rotate the form. Yeah. This is something a lot of people struggle with, which is maintaining a character throughout space and time. Okay. Then let's get into the back view. For a simplified model, just going to again start with a ball. We still got the chin going down. Just making a straight line down and drawing that chin. But from the back view, all that's obscured by the neck. And the sides are a little bit flatter, right? So it's not just like a perfect ball. It's like a ball where you chop off the sides and then angle it down a little bit. Then the neck fits directly underneath. I could do this at another angle. Here now we're looking up at this neck kind of sockets underneath there. So imagine you broke somebody's neck, you did some crazy shit, broke their neck right out of the base of their head. It would fit underneath here. If you get like some action figures, that might be a good way to take those apart and use forms for those. Any sort of thing you can use to get an understanding of how these forms fit together is really valuable. Other trick is from the back view, just make it the same exact shape as your front view. I like to flip back and forth. The only thing that's going to change is going to be the overlaps. So basically just drawing the same exact thing, except now the neck is going to be in front. And we're seeing the back of the ears. It helps to show hair going into the back of the head. It'll make more sense. Also, he's got a giant hat on, which I have not drawn, but we'll ignore the giant hat for now. Think how bad this will be though once we can do turnarounds in 20 years. No, you'll be good. You don't need 20 years to do that. I'm kind of bullshitting this back view. Don't get mad at me. I can make it not BS though. You know what? Here, wait. Quick little lighting tip because we got 10 minutes left in the class. Okay, imagine we've got a sphere and all I'm going to do is put the bottom half of that sphere in shadow. But to make it feel organic, I'm going to chop in and out of that shape some triangles to make it feel more organic and interesting. So that's what we're going to do here. That's how you shade hair. That's the way to do it. Yeah, that's exactly how you should do it. And shapes will foreshorten, so it'll be quite challenging to get those hair shapes. I don't want to focus on that too much just yet because that's not that important. If you can get the head shape rotated, we're not even doing all those in-betweens. We're just doing 0, 45, 90. Was that 180? Yeah. Super duper simple. Everybody knows it's a piece of cake. For this type of thing, for getting used to the head drawings, one piece of cake. Hell yeah. Perfect pun, perfect timing. I really like the Loomis book on this. I think That's one of the best. And honestly, whatever gesture books you guys can find or figure drawing books you can find that are a good addition to this, I would take a look at. You know, part of what I'm trying to show you guys here for the most part is how to push gestures, how to push poses, and how to make it feel like it's just part of your repertoire, something that's like just easy and more intuitive. All right, y'all. Any final questions? Did we learn all of art today? Did we do all of it?
I think we're good.
Awesome. We covered so many things today. It was a lot of stuff. We did heads. We talked about pushing poses, exaggerating them to make them more exciting. A lot of things. And a lot of these themes will come up over and over again. The idea of pushing the poses, exaggerating the angles and that kind of thing will just be something we're going to encounter pretty much every week. And it's the kind of thing, even within the context of doing this professionally and working, I'll be like, oh, how can I push this pose? And so I'm going to end this class by looking at this one more time, which is just a great example of like, they got this pose and then they were just like, wait, what if I leave the arms exactly where they are and then just start pulling the body even further down, right? So that's a great example of what I mean by pushing the pose. It's like all they're doing is just twisting that even more. It's great. It's very, very cool. All right, y'all. Thanks for hanging out with me. Thanks for learning art. For the feedback people, there's some more work to be done. So I'll send you guys another link and we'll finish up. All right, y'all. See you
Okay.
later.
Okay, thanks.
Bye.